Welcome back. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a like. Enjoy the video. A police officer shoots a black girl's horse, unaware his father is a Supreme Court judge. The sound of a gunshot echoed across the field, breaking the tranquility of the countryside. Birds scattered, and the once proud horse collapsed to the ground, its legs giving way beneath it. A young black girl fell with it, screaming in shock and pain. Standing a few feet away, the officer lowered his smoking gun, his face hard but marked with uncertainty. Little did he know the repercussions of his actions would reach the highest court in the land. The sun had just begun to rise over the rolling fields of green. Dew shimmered like tiny jewels on the grass, and the soft murmur of a creek nearby filled the air with an almost meditative calm. 12-year-old Amara Williams led her horse Midnight down the dirt trail that wound through the countryside. Her father had always said this time of morning was magic, a reminder that every day offered a chance to start anew. Amara's affection for Midnight was as profound as her love for the tales her grandmother shared about their ancestors. The horse was more than a mere animal. He was her companion, her confidant, and sometimes her escape. She'd spend hours grooming his sleek black coat, whispering secrets into his ear, and dreaming of a future where she'd compete in equestrian tournaments and prove that a girl like her could shine in a world that often seemed intent on dimming her light. The dirt beneath her boots crunched softly as she walked Midnight toward the clearing where she'd practice. The trail was surrounded by tall oaks, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and earth. Everything felt perfect, as if the world itself had conspired to grant her this moment of peace. Amara's small town wasn't particularly welcoming to change or diversity. People knew each other's names and business, but there were unspoken boundaries drawn between those who belonged and those who didn't quite fit in. The Williams family, with their quiet pride and strong sense of self, often found themselves on the wrong side of those boundaries. But Amara's father had taught her to stand tall and claim her space, no matter how small or invisible others tried to make it. Midnight snorted softly, his ears twitching as they entered the clearing. Amara smiled and adjusted the reins, her mind already racing with plans for their next ride. She envisioned a day when she'd gallop freely in a competition ring, applause roaring in her ears, her family cheering her on from the stands. But dreams can shatter in an instant, and the first crack came with the sound of a car engine idling in the distance. The low growl of the engine grew louder, slicing through the peaceful hum of nature like a jagged blade. Amara's grip on Midnight's reins tightened as she turned her head toward the sound. A black SUV emerged from the tree-lined road, its windows tinted and its tires kicking up a cloud of dust. She didn't recognize the vehicle, but she could feel the weight of its presence. Midnight snorted, shifting uneasily beneath her hand. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice calm but her heart beginning to race. The SUV rolled to a stop just a few yards away, the engine rumbling as if it were holding its breath. The driver's door creaked open, and out stepped a uniformed police officer, his face set like stone, his eyes scanning the clearing with an air of authority that felt more invasive than protective. Amara swallowed hard, her instincts screaming at her to stay still. The officer's hand rested casually on his holstered gun, but to Amara, it felt like a silent threat. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice sharp and clipped. "No, sir," Amara replied, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound composed. "This is my family's land." The officer's eyes narrowed. "This land is close to private property. I'll need to see some identification." Amara hesitated. She didn't carry anything like that with her when she came to practice. I don't have any ID with me," she stammered. The officer's jaw tightened. "Then you shouldn't be here," he snapped. "Get that animal under control and leave." Midnight let out a loud whinny, his ears flattening against his head. The officer took a step back, his hand now gripping his gun. "Control that horse!" he barked, his tone laced with irritation and something darker, fear. "He's just scared," Amara said quickly, holding up her hands in a placating gesture. "Please don't." Her words were drowned out by a sudden movement. Midnight reared slightly, his hooves pawing at the air as he tried to shake off the tension. The officer reacted instinctively. The gunshot was deafening, a crack that echoed through the clearing and sent birds flying from the treetops. Amara screamed as Midnight collapsed, his powerful body crumpling to the ground. She fell with him, her hands scrambling to touch his neck, to feel for life that she desperately hoped was still there. The officer stood frozen, his gun still raised, his face pale. I didn't mean to," he muttered, the confidence draining from his voice. Tears streamed down Amara's face as she knelt beside Midnight. "You shot him!" she cried, her voice breaking with anguish. In that moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The serenity of the morning was gone, replaced by chaos and pain, and at the center of it all stood a man who didn't yet realize the true consequences of what he'd done. Amara knelt beside Midnight, her hands trembling as she pressed them against his neck. The warmth of his body was fading, and his labored breaths were becoming shallower with each passing second. Tears blurred her vision, but her voice was clear and raw with pain. Why would you do this?" The officer stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. His gun was holstered now, but his hand hovered near it like an involuntary reflex. "It was an accident," he muttered, his tone defensive. "An accident." Amara's voice rose, cutting through the stillness of the clearing. "You didn't even try to understand. You saw a scared horse and decided to shoot." The officer's face hardened, his posture stiffening as if her words were a threat. "You were in a restricted area. I warned you! This isn't restricted!" Amara shot back, her voice cracking with anger. "This is our land. My family has lived here for generations." The officer hesitated, the weight of her words momentarily cracking his facade, but he quickly recovered, shifting the blame. "I don't know that," he said sharply. "You didn't have any proof." "Proof?" Amara laughed bitterly, though her tears continued to fall. "You didn't need proof. You just saw me, a black girl with her horse, and decided I didn't belong. That's all the proof you needed." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment the officer looked unsure. He glanced back at his SUV, as though seeking an escape from the mounting tension. "What's your name?" he asked abruptly, his tone gruff. Amara glared at him, her jaw tightening. "Why? So you can add it to some report and pretend this never happened?" The officer's lips thinned into a grim line. "I need to document this. It's protocol." "Protocol?" Amara repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Where was your protocol when you pulled that trigger?" The officer opened his mouth to respond but stopped. He looked at Midnight's lifeless body, then at Amara's tear-streaked face. For a split second, something resembling regret flickered in his eyes. Amara noticed it, but it only fueled her anger. "Do you even know what you've done?" she demanded, rising to her feet, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "Midnight was my best friend. He was all I had when the world felt too heavy, and now he's gone because you couldn't see me as a person." The officer's expression shifted, but it wasn't remorse, it was frustration. "Listen, I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice lower but no less strained. "But you have to understand, in my line of work, I don't have time to second guess." "Second guess? Second guess?" Amara's voice was sharp. "You didn't even first guess." The officer sighed, running a hand over his face. "Of Kendrick. Look, I'll file the report. I'll tell them what happened, but there's nothing I can do now." "Nothing you can do?" Amara stepped closer, her eyes blazing with fury. "You can't undo this. But you can take responsibility. You can admit you were wrong." The officer met her gaze, his own filled with a mixture of defiance and unease. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "Maybe not to me," Amara said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "But someone will make you answer for this." Before he could respond, the sound of another car engine reached their ears. Amara turned to see her father's pickup truck pulling into the clearing, dust kicking up in its wake. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a fresh wave of anger, as she thought of how she'd have to explain what had happened. Her father stepped out, his face a mask of concern and confusion as he saw Amara and the officer standing over Midnight's body. "Amara," he called, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Amara didn't answer immediately. She pointed at the officer, her voice shaking with fury. "He shot Midnight, Daddy! He didn't even ask questions! He just pulled the trigger!" Her father's eyes darkened, and he turned to the officer, his calm demeanor now laced with steel. "You'd better have a good explanation for this." The officer straightened his shoulders, tense. "Sir, I was responding to a potential trespassing call. The horse became agitated and... You shot a child's horse, Amara's father interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. On her own family's land. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the weight of the truth seemed to settle over him, silencing whatever excuse he'd been about to offer. The tension in the air was palpable, every word from Amara's father a hammer striking the officer's brittle resolve. The officer shifted uneasily, his fingers twitching as if he could still feel the trigger under them, his gaze darting between Amara, her father, and the lifeless form of Midnight on the ground. I didn't mean for this to happen, he repeated, his voice weak now. All the bravado from earlier was completely drained. Amara's father crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. Meaning doesn't change the outcome. My daughter's horse is dead, and you pulled the trigger. Before the officer could muster a response, another car approached the scene. This one wasn't a truck or a patrol vehicle. It was a sleek, silver sedan, its glossy exterior gleaming even under the morning sun. As it came to a stop, the officer's face turned ashen. The door opened, and a tall, stately man stepped out. His graying hair was impeccably groomed, and he moved with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. Amara didn't recognize him, but the officer clearly did. The man's presence seemed to shrink him. Dad, the officer stammered, his voice cracking like a guilty child caught red-handed. Amara's eyes widened, her mind racing. Dad? The officer's father? Who was this man? The older man's gaze swept over the scene, taking in every detail. The officer's nervous stance, the grief-stricken girl, the lifeless horse, and Amara's father's smoldering anger. His jaw tightened as he walked closer. What is the meaning of this? The man asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded answers. Amara's father stepped forward, his stance unflinching. Are you this officer's superior? The older man's lips pressed into a thin line. Not quite. I'm Chief Justice Wilson, he said evenly, his eyes locking onto the officer's. And this is my son. The words hit like a thunderclap. Amara's father's jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch. Amara felt her knees weaken, but she held herself upright, her fists still trembling at her sides. The officer, no, Wilson's son, shifted uncomfortably. Dad, Quiet, the Chief Justice snapped, silencing him instantly. His eyes didn't waver as he turned back to Amara's father. Mr. Williams, I presume? That's right, Amara's father said, his voice firm. And you should know that your son just killed my daughter's horse on our land. Chief Justice Wilson's expression darkened, his gaze cutting back to his son. Is this true? I thought, the officer began, but his father's glare stopped him cold. You thought what? The Chief Justice demanded, his voice sharp. You thought you could act without thinking, without confirming facts, without considering the consequences? The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Amara, emboldened by the shift in power, stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though it carried the weight of her pain. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't care. He just saw me and assumed I didn't belong here. The Chief Justice turned to her, his face softening for a moment. And you are Amara Williams, he said, her chin held high. This is my horse, Midnight, or was. Her voice broke slightly on the last word, but she didn't falter. Chief Justice Wilson nodded slowly. Amara, I'm truly sorry for what's happened here. No apology can undo this. But I want you to know that I will not let this go unaddressed. Words aren't enough, Amara's father said, his voice low and firm. Your son has to be held accountable just like anyone else. The Chief Justice nodded again, his face grim. You're absolutely right. He turned to his son. Go to the car now. Dad, Now, the Chief Justice barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer hesitated but eventually walked to the sedan, his shoulders slumped. As the officer disappeared into the car, Chief Justice Wilson turned back to Amara and her father. This will not be swept under the rug, he said, his voice firm. I can promise you that. My son's actions were reckless and inexcusable. Amara's father crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. And how do we know you'll follow through? The Chief Justice reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. This is my direct line. You'll be hearing from my office within the day. There will be a full investigation, and my son will face the consequences of his actions. You have my word." Amara stared at the card, then at the man holding it. His sincerity seemed genuine, but her grief and anger weren't so easily quelled. "Midnight is gone," she said softly. "Nothing will bring him back." The Chief Justice's shoulders sagged slightly, his expression softening. "No, it won't. But justice can be served, and justice must be served." For the first time, the weight of the title Chief Justice felt like a beacon rather than a shield. 2 weeks later, Amara stood in the courthouse lobby beside her father. The building's marble walls and high ceilings seemed cold, intimidating, yet oddly fitting for the weight of the moment. The name Chief Justice Wilson was engraved on a plaque near the entrance, a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play. But today, power was being used differently. Today, accountability had taken center stage. Inside the courtroom, the Chief Justice presided not as a father protecting his son, but as a man of law determined to uphold justice. Officer Wilson sat at the defendant's table, his polished badge removed, his uniform replaced by a plain suit that did nothing to shield him from the judgment in the room. His father's words were firm and unyielding as he announced the court's decision: a suspension without pay, mandatory cultural sensitivity training, and a formal apology to Amara and her family. It wasn't everything Amara had hoped for. No punishment could bring Midnight back. But it was a step, a small victory, in a system that rarely acknowledged its flaws. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around, cameras flashing, and microphones thrust forward. Amara's father shielded her from the chaos. But when one reporter asked her how she felt, she stopped and turned. "I feel like justice is a beginning, not an end," she said, her voice clear and steady. "What happened to Midnight should never happen to anyone else, human or animal. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about the way people see each other and the assumptions they make. Change starts when we stop assuming and start listening." Her words echoed across social media that evening, sparking conversations about race, privilege, and accountability. Amara's story became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of loss and pain, voices could rise and demand change. In the weeks that followed, the police department announced a review of its use of force policies, with a focus on de-escalation and bias training. Amara and her father were invited to community forums, where they spoke about their experience and advocated for systemic reform. Late one evening, as Amara stood by the pasture where Midnight once roamed, her father joined her. "You did good today," he said quietly, his hand resting on her shoulder. Amara nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Midnight deserved better, but maybe now someone else will get the chance. The death of Midnight was a tragedy that no apology or court ruling could undo, but it was all a moment of reckoning, a call to question the biases and assumptions that permeate society. Amara's loss sparked something larger than her family's grief. It became a rallying point for change. In the months that followed, her small town took steps to confront uncomfortable truths. The police department implemented mandatory training on de-escalation and implicit bias, and community members began holding regular forums to address systemic issues. Amara, despite her youth, became a voice for justice, her words resonating far beyond her town's borders. But this wasn't just a story about policies or reforms. It was about the resilience of the human spirit and the courage it takes to demand accountability. Amara's strength in the face of injustice reminded everyone that no voice is too small to make a difference. Change is slow, and progress is often met with resistance. But the seeds planted that day in the clearing continued to grow. Midnight's legacy became a symbol of hope, a reminder that justice begins with listening, with seeing each other as human, and with refusing to let silence prevail. As Amara stood before a crowd at a national rally months later, her voice rang clear. "We can't change the past, but together we can build a future where no one is unseen." Here on Karma's Twists, we share the most impactful stories of karma and justice that the world needs to see. Don't miss a single moment of good triumphing over evil. Join our community and subscribe. Be part of the movement that believes justice always wins.